Center for Educational Freedom. He previously served as a legislator in the New Hampshire House of Representatives, and he received his master's in public policy with a focus in education policy from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. And today he will be speaking to us about school choice. So,
Thank you all for having me. Serving in the New Hampshire legislature is actually not quite as impressive as it may sound. New Hampshire has the largest state legislature in the country next to Congress. Actually, well, largest in the country in terms of the states, second only next to Congress. 400 legislators in the House in a state of 1.3 million people, so that's roughly one legislator for every 3,300 citizens. Obviously, some of those can't vote because they are not yet 18 or choose not to vote. So there are literally high school class presidents that received more votes than it takes to get to the New Hampshire state legislature, which is, in a way, the way it should be. It's the most representative body, the democratic body in the world. But we're not here to talk about New Hampshire today. We're here to talk about school choice and the education system in the United States. I want to start with a question for the audience, which is, what is the purpose of education? And we'll focus on K-12 education, not higher ed. What is the purpose of K-12 education? Does anybody want to offer your opinion? It's not a... Go ahead. Yeah.
It's a way of functioning in society.
Okay, making sure that society functions. Yeah?
Preparing young people to be functional adults.
Be functional adults, okay, but in what sense functional? What does that mean?
Social
Work, be a good worker.
I would say it lays like an educational groundwork for you to be able to go on and achieve whatever you want to later on in life.
Okay, so mostly, but we're talking here mostly like in terms of work, to be a good worker. Okay, Professor?
Brainwashing to love the state.
Brainwashing to love the state. Anyone else? I saw a hand over here.
Yeah, I would say increase their market revenue productivity.
Okay, I can tell I'm in the economics department.
kind of like create a greater skill set and just a general overview of things for career determination later on.
Okay. All right, so mostly we focused here on the economic prospects of the child's when they reach adulthood. There's some mention of socialization. The professor mentioned being a good citizen, in not so many terms, not quite those words. But the original reason in the United States why there was a push toward public school is religion. It was so that you would be a good Christian. And the Massachusetts Bay Colony actually passed an act in 1647 called the Old Deluder Satan Act, named after the first 3 words of the bill, which explains that the old deluder Satan was trying to trick people in their ignorance into doing X, Y, and Z, and so the way that we avoid getting tricked by Satan is by having a good, proper Christian education where students will be able to read the Bible, and of course to read the Bible you have to know how to read, and therefore any town that has more than 50 families must provide a teacher for students. Any town that has more than 100 families must actually also use their tax dollars to pay for a facility in which to have those students. By the era of the Founding Fathers, you get arguments like this. If a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be, from Thomas Jefferson, who was also a proponent of education for the young. Now he believed basically like 1 and 100, maybe less, would actually go on to university. But this was sort of the beginning of this argument that if we are going to have a representative democracy, we need to have an educated populace. Otherwise, it's going to descend into mobocracy, and people are just going to vote themselves each other's wealth, and we are going to have a collapse of the republic, sort of like Athenian democracy went downhill. The Founding Fathers were very concerned about that. And so you have this second argument. Much later on, you start having this debate about, let's say, today you heard the debate humanities versus STEM education, science, tech education, engineering, and math. So what should the focus be? But the original focus was actually 1, religion, and 2, citizenship. So where are we today? Today, the focus has been very much on what you were talking about here, which is job prospects, your economic power. During the Reagan administration, there was this report, this very famous report, A Nation at Risk, the Imperative for Education Reform. The most famous or infamous words in this report were, if an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. Describing how terrible the system had become, how most of the other developed nations in the world had surpassed the United States. And this, again, was about 30 years ago that this came out. But where are we today? Not doing well. Actually, you won't even find the United States on this slide. You won't find them until the next slide. There's the US average performance in math compared to all of the other developed nations on a test called the PISA. This is an international exam. The US ranks 32nd in its proficiency in math, with actually only 32% of students proficient in mathematics at that level. So you can see the United States is actually not doing very well at all. Here are all of these developed nations. So the question might be, well, is it because we're not spending enough money on education? Maybe we just need to spend more money. The United States is where those two lines meet. Any country that is in the top left quadrant is spending less than the United States and achieving more than the United States. Which is to say, just about every single nation in the developed world is spending less per pupil and is achieving more than the United States. So performance is really not correlated with additional spending. Our spending has dramatically increased. Now these figures are actually adjusted for inflation. 1970, over the course of 13, K through 12 public education, the cost per pupil over those 13 years of school was about $57,000 per pupil. It is just about tripled. It is now over $160,000 per pupil over the course of their education that we're spending. We are spending roughly now in public schools about $13,000 per pupil per year on average. And it's actually even higher in some places. Washington, D.C., which has one of the worst school districts in the country, also has one of the most expensive. They're spending $30,000 per pupil, according to the Census Bureau, and have almost nothing to show for it. So we're spending a lot more. These are, the blue is the spending trend, but our performance actually over the last 50 years has been absolutely flat. We don't see any improvement on any of the different tests. This is the NAEP, also known as the Nation's Report Card. No improvement. My boss, Andrew Colson, Cato Institute, came up with this chart. Recently, he did the same thing using SATs. Likewise, no improvement over the course of 50 years, even though spending has about tripled. And that's, again, in inflation-adjusted dollars. So we're spending more, we're not achieving more. Why are we spending so much more? In part, it's because, to a great extent, it's because of the increase in personnel, especially relative to the increase in students. So from 1950 to 2009, basically you have just about a doubling of the student population, but the personnel increased much higher, 386% increase in total school personnel, and we see that it's mostly administrators and staff. So you have a 96% increase in the number of students, and in that time period, you've got a 252% increase in teachers and a 702% increase in non-teaching staff. This is what we're calling the school staffing surge. Just from 1992 to 2009, you see 17% increase in students, 46% increase in non-teaching staff. Here in Louisiana, you actually had a decrease in the student population of 13%. Nevertheless, even though enrollment is declining, we need more teachers, we need more administrators. So how are people being educated? Well, the vast majority are in public schools around the country. You've got about 83% of families are in public schools, only about 9% are in private schools, 3% are in what's called charter schools, and 4.3% and 3% homeschooling. Charter schools are public schools. So if you actually add charter and public, you're getting close to 90% that are participating in public schools. Charter schools are completely public, they're publicly financed, they're often privately administered, sometimes by nonprofits, sometimes by for-profits. They have fewer rules and regulations than traditional public schools. Students aren't assigned to them based on a zip code like a traditional public school. You have to opt in. But they're not allowed to be religious. They're not allowed to have any enrollment requirements, so they can't say we only take high-performing students. If there's an oversubscription, they have to have a lottery. They can't, there's no merit-based acceptance to these schools. And they still have to teach the state curriculum. They're usually also administering the state tests. So charter schools, they're often not unionized, so again, they have fewer rules and regulations than traditional public schools, but these are still public schools. Just to get that out there. I know this is a big issue in New Orleans because all of New Orleans public schools have now transferred to charter schools in the Wake Park and Katrina. So here's what parents are getting. What do parents want? If they could choose any type of school if money was no object, 40% would actually be in private school as opposed to nearly 9%. The number that are in public school drops from 83% to 37%. Homeschooling actually would significantly increase from 3 to about 11%, and there would be some more students in charter schools, about 10%. So again, here's the blue is what they're getting, and the red is what they want. This is what the market would look like. Yes, got it.
What's a virtual school?
Oh, a virtual school is
You have it on
an
there?
online school.
Ah,
So essentially, it's like homeschooling, where you're usually at home, although in some cases you would actually go to a physical building and everybody is sort of in front of a computer. But all the classes are on, I think, Khan Academy, for those who are familiar with Khan Academy, that sort of virtual school. Florida has something called Florida Virtual School. It's actually run by the state, but students can take 1 or 2 classes a day. They would go into the computer lab and they would take a class on Chinese. There's nobody in their building teaches Chinese, but they can go learn Chinese at the virtual school. And then some people are doing it entirely at home. So that's how that works. All right, so what is this idea of school choice? Well, it starts really, if you go way back, it actually starts in the Enlightenment era. There were some figures that were talking about it. But in the modern era, it's Milton Friedman, who had this idea of what he called vouchers. So Friedman said, you can make an economic case why we should have education, because there are neighborhood effects or spillover effects. If you've got a lot of students, a lot of children who are uneducated, that can be very bad for society. You're making sort of Thomas Jefferson argument. If you don't have, intelligent, educated citizens, then it could lead to chaos. And if you, on the flip side, if you have educated, productive members of society, then you're going to increase GDP, you're going to increase the living standards. So in other words, every individual's education, there's private benefit, but there's also a benefit to the public. And so there is this economic case for having state financing of education. But Friedman argued that it doesn't follow from this argument that the state should also be the one providing education. We actually see in a number of other areas, take housing policy, hunger policy, and in healthcare. You used to have a situation where the government was providing government cheese. You wanted, if somebody was poor, they would have to go to this local government office, and they would essentially get surplus food that was usually pretty bad. Now they have SNAP. They can go to a regular grocery store like anybody else. They have access to higher quality food. If you had, back in the day, there were the projects. There was a government-owned building. These were notorious for being run down, for being dangerous. Now they have Section 8. At least they have access to, the private market. Likewise, when it came to healthcare, there used to be the county hospitals, which were notorious for not providing good quality care. Now there's Medicaid, where for all its imperfections, it's an improvement over the previous system because we're able to go to a private hospital. Those who are still stuck in an entirely government-run system are the veterans. And the VA hospitals are, again, embroiled in scandal because of the poor quality of care that they have offered and the huge waiting lists where veterans are literally dying on the waiting list while waiting for care. So Friedman noted that you have this problem of incentives, okay? Whose money are you spending and on whom is it spent? If you're spending money that is your own money, you have an incentive to economize. You have an incentive to spend as little as possible. If you're spending money on yourself, you have an incentive to maximize value. You want the greatest bang for your buck. So ideally, you want to be in a situation where incentives are best aligned when you're spending your own money on yourself. Then you're going to look for the greatest value. The greatest value yourself, the lowest cost. The worst situation is when you're spending somebody else's money on somebody else. That's when you have the weakest incentive to maximize value and the weakest incentive to economize. When the government is providing a service, it is people that are spending other people's money on other people. And that's why it tends to be that the service is not so great. Our public school system is full of very well-natured bureaucrats who are spending other people's money on other people. A voucher system moves you from category 4 to category 3, where the money, instead of being spent at the public school, is instead given directly to the parents. And the parents are then spending the taxpayers' dollars on themselves. So at the very least, in this scenario, they have a strong incentive to maximize value for their children. So how does it work? So right here's the status quo. The money goes from the taxpayers to the government then gives it to district schools. Students are assigned to the district school based on where their parents happen to live. The vouchers, the money goes directly to the parents. Now there's an issue here. There's something called the Know-Nothing Clause, or the Blaine Amendment, which was in the late 1800s. I'll just say, for example, the voucher question has been settled under First Amendment law at the U.S. Supreme Court over a decade ago in a case called Zellman versus Simmons-Harris, where the Supreme Court ruled no problem with the First Amendment because the money is only going to a religious school. You may say that may be a problem with the First Amendment. They say, no, the only way that money ends up at a religious school is through the choices of parents. It's no different than somebody using their SNAP funds to have a Passover dinner, or somebody that's on Section 8 inviting people over to their house or apartment to study the Bible. Any entanglement with religion is entirely the choice of that particular individual. But at the state level, in the late 1800s, when, as I said before, all of the public schools were de facto Protestant schools. They were teaching Bible in a non-denominational Protestant manner so that any Episcopalian or Congregationalist or Baptist would feel comfortable sending their child to the school and learning the Bible according to that way. Except Catholics, and to a lesser extent Lutherans. So when Catholics started coming to this country in greater and greater numbers, they said, well, you're funding the Protestant school through our tax dollars. Our tax dollars should also fund the Catholic schools. Now the Protestants turned around and said, what are you talking about? We are funding non-denominational schools. This isn't an Episcopalian school, this is a non-denominational common school. It's for everybody. And if you Catholics want your own schools, that's your right. You have to pay for them. And so they tried to pass an amendment to the US Constitution which failed that would limit funding only to non-sectarian schools. But it did pass in almost every single state constitution. So in about 40 states, there's a clause that says that public funds can't go to religious schools. Now some courts have nevertheless interpreted like the First Amendment, and they just sort of say, no, the money's not going to a school, it's going to an individual, and they can do it with it what they want. Others are a little more strict. And so there was this idea, well, we can have tax credits instead. So here's how this works. A scholarship tax credit. The taxpayers make donations to a nonprofit scholarship organization. The scholarship organization then funds low and middle income families to attend the schools of their choice. And the donors to the scholarship organizations get a tax credit of anywhere between 50 and 100% depending on the state. So in other words, you have a tax burden of $1,000 in Georgia. You made a donation to this scholarship organization, and your tax burden is now zero, and you've made, instead of $1,000 to the government, you paid $1,000 to this scholarship organization. There's a law like this in Louisiana. There's some issues with it, in my opinion. It's highly regulated. They require the state test. That's actually kept a lot of private schools from participating, and even student participation is very, very low. But this situation avoids the coercion issue, because donations, some people may object, well, I don't want my tax dollars going to some religious school that I don't agree with. I might also object, I don't want my tax dollars going to the public school, because I don't like what they're teaching there either. So I think that the argument is the same. But here, the donations to the scholarship organization are entirely voluntary. And the US Supreme Court ruled that this is not public money, even though a tax credit is involved. Because the money, again, goes from a private taxpayer to a private scholarship organization to private families for use of private schools. At no point do these funds enter the public treasury, and therefore the US Supreme Court ruled we're not dealing with public money. Until it reaches the tax collector's hand, it's not public money. Any question?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So how does like an investor direct the money to a certain school? They can't send it to a certain school. It has to go to a certain scholarship organization.
So it goes to the scholarship organization. And now there are some scholarship organizations. In most states, there's a limit on this program that scholarship organizations have to fund at least 2 schools. In some states, you can have a scholarship organization that only funds 1 school. But in many cases, you'll say, for example, the Catholic diocese will open up a scholarship organization that funds students attending all of the Catholic schools. There are Jewish and Muslim and other types of scholarship organizations. Some scholarship organizations have a certain educational philosophy. So for example, there will be a Montessori scholarship organization that only funds Montessori schools. So the donor can either choose to donate to a scholarship organization like that is specific to a certain type of school. And then there are some scholarship organizations that say we fund any child that shows up to any school that they want to go to. And so if a donor wants to do that, that's what they can do. So it gives more freedom for the donor and more freedom for the schools and children. There's also something called education savings accounts, which try to move into that first category. They don't. I have a little arrow there because they don't quite get there. There are 2 states that have education savings accounts. They're both publicly funded. You could design it with a tax credit. The 2 that exist now are in Florida and Arizona. The major difference is how the funds are spent. So at the collegiate level, there's an issue called the Bennett effect, which is that when you have Pell Grants and you've got subsidized loans, tuition is climbing. You may have noticed. Tuition is climbing every single year faster than the rate of inflation. So what do? The politicians say, oh my gosh, the tuition is going up and up. It's less and less affordable. We should give people more money. And then what happens? Well, the tuition goes up. So so you get this cycle. So there's a concern that if you have widespread voucher programs, or even tax credit programs, you may see the Bennett effect at the K-12 level. So the education savings accounts try to get away from that. One reason you've got this effect is because I have to spend this entire sum of money. I get $5,000, whether from a scholarship organization or from the government. I have to spend the entire $5,000 in 1 year, in one place, at one time. Well, if it's a $5,000 voucher, there's not a single school that's going to set its price at below $5,000. They'd be crazy. They're leaving money on the table. And it could fuel tuition inflation. With an education savings account, I am not limited where I spend it. It has to be spent for educational purposes, but I'm not limited to one place. It could be private school tuition. It could also be tutoring, textbooks, homeschool curricula, online learning, or I could save it in a college savings plan. And the money that's unspent rolls over from year to year. So it starts to look more like Category 1 spending. Because there's multiple places I can spend it, I can also save it. I treat it more like my own money. So education savings accounts are sort of the next wave in school choice. The number of school choice programs has dramatically increased. Just in the last decade or so, it's more than tripled. These are all the states, hard to see here, but these are all the states starting with Wisconsin in 1990 with a voucher program. This is actually out of date because Kansas also has a program now. But you can see each year you've got more and more states, especially recently, adopting school choice laws. Here are the states that have them. Again, this is out of date because it's missing Kansas and it's missing the education savings account in Florida. But there are 21 voucher laws in 11 states plus DC. Vouchers average about $6,000 per voucher. There are 18 scholarship tax credit laws now operating in 14 states. The average is about $2,200, $2,300 per scholarship. And there are 2 education savings accounts programs, one in Arizona, one in Florida. But a number of states we're looking at this year. There are actually bills in legislatures in 10 states right now. One just passed the Mississippi Senate, another just passed the Virginia House. So I think we'll actually probably see a few adopted this year. What's the evidence for school choice? How am I doing on time? Fine, good. So the evidence. So start with academic outcomes. There have been 13 studies of school choice policies. These are 13 gold standard studies. So these are randomized controlled trials. Right? Sort of like for medicine. You take a group of people, you randomly divide them into 2 different groups. One of them I give a drug, the other I give a placebo. I measure the difference in the effect on both, and that difference is attributed to the treatment. Right? So what we have here is, let's say you have a voucher law, there's oversubscription. And so we hold a lottery. So now you're comparing the lottery winners versus the lottery losers. The reason you want to do that is you can't just compare public schools to private schools because, okay, yeah, private schools are doing better, but maybe it's because they're premium. Maybe it's because they're just getting parents that are more interested in education. So maybe even if you're controlling for race and socioeconomic status and other things like that, there may be some intangible quality that you can't measure. But here, if you have a randomized controlled trial, you don't have to worry about that because whatever intangible quality is actually going to be equally present in both groups because the only difference between them is random chance. So the results have been overwhelmingly positive. All of the studies but one found a statistically significant positive impact on the participants, in other words, the voucher recipients. One found no visible effect. No studies have found any harm. So what do we mean when we're talking about positive impact? So for example, there was a study on the Washington, D.C. voucher program. Those that were in the treatment group that received a voucher, 91% graduated from high school versus the control of 70%. Now again, the control are students who applied for a voucher and did not receive a voucher. Some others, for example, Wisconsin, 7.2% percentage points higher graduation rates. In New York City, there was a private scholarship program. There were a number of studies from Harvard University on that. They found that among black students, the scholarship recipients were 24% more likely to enroll in a private four-year college. In Washington, D.C., the test scores of the voucher recipients were higher than the control group, the equivalent of about 3.7 additional months of learning over 3 years. So higher graduation rates, higher college matriculation, higher test scores. This is what we've seen. But you may say, okay, but this could come at the expense of those who are left behind in the public schools. This is an argument you hear often. If a whole bunch of students are leaving, going to the private schools, we may assume that these are the families where the parents are more interested in education because they're actively opting out and they're taking resources with them. And so now you have public schools that have fewer resources and fewer students who have active and engaged parents. And so you may see a decline in the public school system. Well, there's actually been, you can't do a randomized control trial here, but there have been 24 studies. This is actually one of the most studied questions in education policy. And all but one found a positive impact. One found no impact whatsoever, and none found a negative effect. Interestingly, the one that found no impact was in Washington, D.C., where they insulated the public schools from competition. So the money came from an entirely different pot. Instead of the money following the child out the door, the child would leave, Congress would throw some money at that child, but whatever money was allocated for that child in the public school stayed in the public school. So now the public school has the same amount of money that they had before, they just have a few students fewer to educate. And not surprisingly, there was no economic incentive for them to compete. Now, why, you would think, well, with possibly the creaming issue, with fewer resources, the public schools, why are we seeing this? Well, because the public schools now must compete. In the system they have now, there already is school choice in every state, and that school choice is wealthy parents can choose to live in a district with a high-performing public school, or they can afford to send their kids to a private school. Low-income families can't. They're stuck basically with their assigned public school. And that public school often is not the best quality school. The urban schools that have a lower income population tend to be the worst schools. To a great extent because they're a monopoly, because they have a captive audience. Once you give those students the option of going somewhere else, the school now must be more responsive to their needs. And so they have the political will to make the changes that are necessary to improve. And that's actually what the evidence is suggesting. Now, none of these are huge effect sizes. Most of them are small, statistically significant, but small, but at least in the positive direction. And you've got small school choice programs, and we've